The Galactic Council had ruled the stars for 12 million years. 7 ancient species had built it together, back when most worlds were still balls of hot rock and gas. They had created laws that governed a quarter of the entire galaxy. They had seen thousands of species rise and fall. They had watched empires turn to dust. Nothing surprised them anymore. Nothing scared them. They believed they had seen everything the universe could offer. Then they found Earth. The scout ship discovered the small blue planet during a routine survey of an unremarkable spiral arm of the galaxy. The captain looked at his sensors and almost laughed. Another primitive world. Another young species still playing with fire and sharp sticks. He wrote his report in less than 10 minutes. Carbon-based life forms. No faster-than-light travel, extremely violent history. Recommendation, place under quarantine and observe. Strategic value, none. The report traveled through the vast bureaucracy of the Galactic Council. It passed through hundreds of offices and thousands of hands. Most officials barely glanced at it. Primitive species were discovered every few years. They were never important. They never mattered. Of the delegation received the file on a busy afternoon. He was an ancient being, over 4,000 years old, with scales that shimmered like liquid metal. He had reviewed thousands of such reports in his long career. He stamped the Earth file with the lowest possible classification and forgot about it before his next meal. The Council did not think about humans again for nearly a century. During that century, humans did what humans always do. They fought wars. They made peace. They built machines that could think. They split atoms and touched their moon. They looked up at the stars with hungry eyes and dreamed of the day they would walk among them. When human scientists finally cracked the secret of faster-than-light travel, the Council was forced to pay attention. Quarantine was no longer practical. A primitive species with warp capability could cause problems if left alone. Better to bring them into the fold, give them rules to follow, and keep them under control. Ambassador Sarah was 47 years old when the Galactic Council made formal contact with Earth. She had spent her entire career preparing for this moment, even though no one had believed it would come in her lifetime. She was a small woman with gray streaks in her black hair and eyes that had seen too much of human cruelty to be easily impressed by alien power. The Council summoned her to their capital world, a planet so old that its original name had been forgotten. The Council Hall was a crystal structure that floated above an endless sea of clouds. It was designed to make visitors feel small. It worked on most species. Sarah walked into that hall with her back straight and her head high. She was surrounded by beings that description. Some were made of light. Others were silicon and metal. A few existed in geometries that made her eyes water when she tried to focus on them. They were ancient beyond measure, powerful beyond imagination. And they looked at her like she was an insect. Rose to speak. He was the same official who had stamped humanity's file a century before, though he did not remember this. To him, humans were just another primitive species that needed to be managed. Ambassador, he said, his voice translated by machines into words she could understand. The Galactic Council welcomes humanity into the community of civilized species. We offer you probationary membership, subject to the following terms. Sarah listened as he read the terms. Restricted trade. No military vessels beyond their home solar system. All new technologies must be shared with the Council, but the Council would share nothing in return. Humans would have representation, but no voting rights. They would follow orders but have no voice in making them. The terms were not unusual. The Council had imposed similar conditions on hundreds of young species throughout history. Most accepted them gratefully. Most were simply happy to be allowed to exist. Finished reading and looked down at the small human woman. You must understand, Ambassador, your species is new, untested. Your history is filled with violence and war. These terms are generous considering what you are. Sarah smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had been underestimated her entire life and had learned to use that underestimation as a weapon. She said, and her voice carried clearly through the vast hall, "With respect, you have clearly never read human history carefully." A ripple of amusement passed through the assembled delegates. The primitive was being defiant. How amusing, how utterly predictable. "We have read your history extensively," replied, a note of condescension in his voice. "We know about your wars, your genocides, your weapons of mass destruction. We know exactly what your species is capable of." "No," Sarah said. "You know what we have done to ourselves. You have no idea what we are capable of doing to others when we are threatened." The council laughed, or they made whatever sounds their various anatomies used for laughter. The human was posturing, nothing more. Every primitive species did this when faced with the reality of their insignificance. It was almost endearing. "Ambassador," said, still smiling, "your species has barely left your home system. You have no fleet to speak of, no weapons that could threaten even our smallest patrol craft. What exactly do you think you could do to us?" Sarah looked up at the ancient. She thought of her grandmother, who had survived a war that killed millions. She thought of her father, who had rebuilt a life from nothing after losing everything. She thought of every human who had ever been told they were too small, too weak, too insignificant to matter. She said, "We are the species that tamed fire when we were still living in caves. We are the species that went to war against our own planet's apex predators and won. We crossed oceans in wooden boats. We cured diseases that had killed us for. We split the atom because we wanted to see if we could." She paused. "We don't respond well to being underestimated. We never have." She reached out and took the document containing the council's terms. She read through it once slowly, making them wait. Then she signed it. "We accept your terms," she said, "for now. But I want you to remember this moment, remember that we warned you." Waved a dismissive hand. "You are welcome to your warnings, Ambassador. In 1,000 years, when your species has matured, perhaps we will revisit these terms." Sarah turned and walked out of the council hall. Behind her, the ancient delegates returned to their business, already forgetting the small human woman who had dared to threaten them. They would remember her soon enough. 3 standard years later, none of them would be laughing. The Dominion had terrorized the edges of council space for over 800 years. They were silicon-based life forms, creatures of crystal and metal that felt no pain and knew no mercy. They did not conquer worlds. They harvested them. To the organic species were nothing more than resources to be collected and processed. The council had never stopped them. They were careful to operate in the spaces between laws, attacking only species that lacked proper protection. By the time the council finished debating responses, they were always gone, their ships full of captured beings destined for fates that no organic creature wanted to imagine. When they turned their attention to humanity's colony on 442b, they expected the usual outcome. A small colony, barely established, protected by a probationary species with no real military power. It would be an easy harvest, a quick profit, nothing more. Commander received the alert at 3 in the morning, ship time. He was 63 years old, a former submarine captain who had spent 30 years underwater before retraining for space combat. He had a face like cracked leather and eyes that had seen too much darkness in too many places. His fleet consisted of 4 ships, 4 outdated council cast-offs that humanity had been allowed to purchase at inflated prices. They had weapons systems 2 generations behind current council standards. Their shields were barely functional. Their engines were slow and unreliable. The fleet numbered 22 vessels. Any sane commander would have evacuated the colony and called for council intervention. Any sensible officer would have recognized that the battle was already lost, was neither sane nor sensible. He was human. "All ships," he said, his voice calm and steady over the communication channel. "Battle stations. We are engaging the enemy." His second-in-command, a young woman named Lieutenant Torres, looked at him with wide eyes. "Sir, we cannot win this fight. The numbers are impossible." "I know," replied. "We are not going to win. We are going to make them pay." The commander broadcast the standard harvest declaration. It was a formality, nothing more. No species had ever resisted a harvest fleet successfully. The message was a courtesy, a chance for the prey to accept their fate with dignity. Its response was to cut all communications and accelerate to full burn. The council observers stationed in the system recorded everything that followed. They would later describe it as the most disturbing battle footage they had ever witnessed. Not because of the violence, though there was plenty of that. What disturbed them was the way the humans fought. Council species fought with precision. They calculated optimal firing ranges and ammunition expenditure. They preserved their ships and crews whenever possible. War was mathematics to them, an equation to be solved with minimal waste. Humans fought like they were already dead. Ships did not maintain safe distances. They charged directly into the formation, weapons firing continuously, shields flickering and failing. When one human ship lost its main guns, it rammed the nearest vessel at full speed. When another lost its engines, the crew continued fighting from a drifting wreck until their life support failed. Himself led the charge. His ship, the UES Defiance, took damage that should have destroyed it a dozen times over. Compartments vented to space. Fires burned through entire decks. The crew fought on, sealing breaches with their own bodies when necessary, rerouting power from life support to weapons. They had never encountered anything like it. Their tactical computers could not process enemies who refused to retreat, who seemed to welcome death if it meant taking enemies with them. Their commanders hesitated, uncertain how to respond to opponents who fought with such terrible fury. That hesitation cost them everything. When the battle finally ended, had lost 3 of his 4 ships. Over 200 human lives were gone. The Defiance was barely holding together, its hull more whole than metal. But the fleet had lost 18 vessels. More than 80% of their force was destroyed or disabled. The survivors limped away into hyperspace, their harvest forgotten, their confidence shattered. The report reached the council chambers within hours. For the first time in living memory, the Great Hall fell silent. Read the battle data 3 times, certain there must be an error. "This is impossible," he said finally. "A probationary species defeating a harvest fleet with inferior technology. How?" The observer who had been studying humanity stepped forward. His name was, and he had spent 3 years living among humans, trying to understand them. What he had learned kept him awake at night. "They did not fight to win," said. "They fought to make the pay a price so terrible that victory would taste like ashes in their mouths." "That is insane," another said. "What kind of species sacrifices itself like that?" "They call it Pyrrhic engagement doctrine," explained. "The concept comes from their ancient history. A king once won a battle against a superior enemy but lost so many soldiers that he said another victory like that would destroy him completely." He paused. Humans learned from that lesson. They learned that sometimes the best way to defeat a stronger enemy is to make every victory cost more than it is worth. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was not how civilized species were supposed to behave. War was meant to be clean, calculated, rational. "They have a saying," continued. "If you strike at a human, you had better kill them, because if you do not, they will never stop coming for you. They will sacrifice everything, burn everything, destroy everything, including themselves, to make you regret ever raising your hand against them." Dismissed this with a wave of his hand. "Primitive bravado, every young species has such sayings. They mean nothing." But notice that this voice was not quite steady. And that night, for reasons he could not explain, the ancient locked his chamber doors before sleeping. He had faced enemies for 4,000 years without fear. Now, for the first time, he was afraid of a species that had only been in space for barely a century. Meanwhile, on the damaged hulk of the Defiance sat alone in his ruined command chair. His ship was dying around him. His crew was decimated. By any reasonable measure, he had lost. But the colony on 442b was safe. 30,000 human lives had been saved, and somewhere out in the darkness of space, they were telling others what had happened. They were spreading the word about the small, primitive species that had made them bleed. Smiled, it was not a pleasant smile. The galaxy was about to learn what humanity really was, and the Galactic Council was about to discover that their greatest mistake was not the terms they had imposed on humanity. Their greatest mistake was assuming that those terms would matter. Within 5 years of first contact, humanity had reverse-engineered Council shield technology. The Council had given them basic shields as part of the probationary agreement, simple defensive systems that were 200 years behind current standards. Human scientists took those shields apart piece by piece, figured out how they worked, and rebuilt them from scratch. Within 7 years, they had made them better. Admiral Ra of the High Command stood before the Council with a report that made her stomach twist with unease. She was one of the finest military minds in the galaxy, a veteran of 1,000 battles, a strategist who had never known defeat. The data in her hands frightened her more than any enemy fleet. "The humans have developed a new shield configuration," she said. "It is more efficient than our current systems by a factor of 3. They use less power and provide better protection." "That is impossible," said. "They lack the educational infrastructure. They do not have access to our research databases. How could they possibly improve on technology that took us to develop?" "I do not know," Ra admitted, "but they have done it, and shields are not the only area where they have made advances." She activated a display showing human technological progress over the past decade. The graph climbed upward at a rate that should have been impossible. Weapons systems, propulsion technology, communications, medical science. Every field showed the same pattern of rapid, almost explosive growth. "They should still be struggling with basic warp field harmonics," Ra said. "By every metric we use to measure species development, they should be centuries away from this level of advancement. But they have 3 generations of our weapons development in less than 10 years. How? The question came from multiple at once. Ra had spent months trying to answer that question. She had studied human research facilities, interviewed human scientists, analyzed their methods and their madness. What she had found everything she thought she knew about technological progress. "They do not innovate the way we do," she explained. "We refine, we optimize, we take existing technologies and make them slightly better generation after generation. Humans do not work that way." She pulled up footage from a human research laboratory. Scientists were arguing loudly, gesturing wildly, scribbling equations on every available surface. It looked like chaos. It was chaos. "They improvise," Ra continued. "They take unrelated technologies and combine them in ways that should not work. They embrace failure as a learning tool, running thousands of experiments that lead nowhere, until suddenly one of them leads somewhere no one expected." "That is incredibly inefficient," I observed. "Yes," Ra agreed, "and yet somehow it works. Because while we are carefully optimizing our existing solutions, they are stumbling onto entirely new approaches that we never considered." She paused, searching for the right words. "They dream, they imagine impossible things, and then they refuse to stop trying until they make them real." The Council's response was predictable. New restrictions were drawn up, limitations on human research, requirements to share all new developments immediately, inspections of human facilities, controls on what technologies humans were allowed to study. Ambassador Sarah, now 52 and grayer than she had been 5 years before, received the new restrictions with the same calm smile she had worn at her first council meeting. "We reject these terms," she said simply. Scales flushed with anger. "You cannot reject them. You are a probationary species. You have no authority to refuse council directives." "Actually," replied, "we can. Article 7 of the Probationary Species Charter states that no restriction may be imposed that fundamentally limits a species' ability to ensure its own survival. Given that the Dominion and others have demonstrated clear hostile intent toward human colonies, we argue that limiting our defensive capabilities would violate this article." The council chamber erupted in chaos. Delegates shouted over each other, demanding explanations, questioning how humans had found such an obscure clause in council law. The answer was simple. Humans had read the rules, all of them. Every law, every precedent, every forgotten amendment that had been passed in 12 million years of council history. They had teams of legal scholars working around the clock, searching for every loophole, every contradiction, every tool they could use. "You wrote these laws," said, her voice cutting through the noise. "Perhaps you should have read them more carefully." The council was forced to withdraw the new restrictions, but the incident made them afraid in a way they had not been afraid in. The humans were not just adapting to galactic civilization. They were learning to manipulate it. Far from council space, in regions that had not seen intelligent life for 100,000 years, something stirred. They had sent word of their defeat to those they served. Ancient beings, older than the council itself, had taken notice of the small species that had drawn blood where none should have been drawn. The architects were awakening. They had seeded the galaxy with life billions of years ago. They had watched empires rise and fall like waves on a beach. They had grown bored with the predictability of it all, retreating into hibernation to wait for something interesting to happen. Now something interesting was happening. A species that did not follow the expected patterns. A species that adapted too quickly, fought too fiercely, and dreamed too boldly. The architects began to move, their ancient ships stirring from slumber in the dark spaces between galaxies. They were coming to see these humans for themselves. And the Galactic Council, for all its power and age, had no idea what was about to descend upon them. Ambassador knew something was wrong. She could feel it in the way council delegates looked at her now, with fear rather than contempt. She could see it in the increased military patrols along the borders of known space. Something was coming, something that made even the ancient powers of the galaxy nervous. She sent a message back to Earth, to the leaders who had trusted her to represent humanity among the stars. The message was short and simple. "Prepare for anything. We are not alone in being watched." Humanity had spent its entire existence preparing for challenges that should have been impossible. They had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that should have ended them. They had climbed out of every pit that fate had dug for them. They would survive this too, whatever it was. They had no other choice. The architects arrived without warning. One moment the sky above the council's capital world was clear. The next moment it was not. Their ship was vast beyond comprehension. It did not orbit the planet. It simply hung there, blocking out the stars, so large that its shadow fell across entire continents. The vessel was older than most of the galaxy's stars. Its hull was made of materials that council scientists could not identify. Its engines operated on principles that known physics. The council's defense fleet scrambled to respond. Thousands of warships, the finest military force in galactic history, took up positions around the ancient vessel. They powered weapons and raised shields and prepared to fight. The architects did not seem to notice them. A voice spoke directly into the minds of every being on the capital world. It did not use words exactly. It used concepts, ideas that formed themselves into meaning without the need for language. "We are the architects. We seeded this galaxy with life before your ancestors were dust. We have watched your council for 12 million years. We do not recognize your authority. We do not fear your weapons." The council's Grand Admiral ordered his fleet to fire. 10,000 ships unleashed their full arsenal at the ancient vessel. Energy beams and missiles and weapons that had never been defeated struck the architect's ship. They did nothing. The attacks did not even leave marks on the hull. "We have come because something interesting has happened. A species has emerged that does not follow the patterns. We wish to evaluate them. The species called humanity will submit to trial. If they fail, they will be unmade. If your council interferes, you will be unmade as well." The council capitulated within hours. They had no choice. The architects were not threatening them. They were simply stating facts. The ancient beings could destroy the entire council with no more effort than a human would use to brush away an insect. Ambassador Sarah received the summons in her quarters. She was 59 years old now, her hair almost completely gray, her face lined with the weight of everything she had carried for humanity. She had always known this moment would come. She just had not known what form it would take. She had 1 hour to prepare. Did not pack weapons. She did not bring guards. She carried only 2 things with her when she boarded the shuttle that would take her to the architect vessel. The first was her grandmother's jade pendant, worn smooth by 3 generations of worried fingers. The second was a folder of documents that she had spent 30 years assembling. The interior of the architect's ship was impossible to describe. Spaces folded in on themselves. Corridors led to rooms that should not have fit inside any structure. The air hummed with energies that made teeth ache. The architect that greeted her was equally impossible. It was part machine, part light, part something that human minds were never designed to comprehend. Looking at it was like looking at a sunset and an equation and a dream all at once. It spoke directly into her mind, bypassing the need for sound. "You are the representative of humanity." "I am," replied. Her voice did not shake. She had practiced keeping it steady for decades. "Your species is an anomaly. Every model we have created predicts your extinction. You should have destroyed yourselves with nuclear weapons. You should have poisoned your planet beyond recovery. You should have fallen into tribal warfare and never emerged. Yet here you stand." "Your models are flawed," said. The architect made a sound that might have been amusement, or might have been something else entirely. "Explain, justify your species' existence. Convince us that you deserve to continue." Opened her folder. Inside were not the things most species would have brought to such a meeting. There were no technological achievements, no military victories, no evidence of power or advancement. Instead, there were stories. Thousands of them. Stories of scientists who had been mocked for their theories and proven right decades later. Stories of artists who had captured truths that logic could never reach. Stories of ordinary people who had run toward disaster when every instinct told them to run away. "You have modeled our aggression," said, "our tribalism, our capacity for destruction. Those things are real. I will not deny them." She spread the documents across the floor of the ancient ship. "But you have missed the other half of the equation." She picked up a photograph. It showed a man carrying a child through flood waters, his face set with determination even as the current tried to pull him under. "This is what we are," she said. "We are the species that builds hospitals in war zones. We send rescue ships into radiation storms. We run toward burning buildings to save strangers we have never met." She picked up another document, a letter written by a scientist who had spent 40 years trying to cure a disease that had killed his daughter. "We look at problems that should be impossible and we refuse to accept that they cannot be solved. We fail 1,000 times and we try again 1,000 more." Her voice was steady, but there was fire in it now. "We looked up at the stars when we were still living in caves, and we said that one day we would walk among them. And then we did." The architect watched her with senses that existed beyond sight. You believe these stories will save you. No, said, I believe these stories are true. I believe they show what humanity really is, not just the violence and the failure, but the hope and the stubborn refusal to give up. She met the architect's impossible gaze without flinching. We are contradictory. We are chaotic. We are absolutely insufferable. But we are also the species that refuses to stop trying to be better, not just for ourselves, but for each other. She laid out the final document. It was a simple list of human sayings, collected from every culture across Earth's history. Every civilization we have ever built has produced the same ideas, she said. Love your neighbor, help those in need. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We fail at these ideals constantly, but we never stop believing in them. We never stop trying. The architect was silent for a long time. In that silence, could feel the weight of billions of years of observation, of countless species that had risen and fallen while these ancient beings watched. You argue that your flaws are inseparable from your virtues, that the same chaos that drives your violence also drives your creativity, that the same stubbornness that leads to your wars also leads to your greatest achievements. Yes, said. This is not a defense. This is simply a description. It is all I have, admitted. I cannot promise you that humanity will never fail. I cannot promise that we will never do terrible things, but I can promise you that we will never stop trying to be more than we are. We will never stop dreaming of something better. She straightened her shoulders. If that is not enough, then unmake us, but know exactly what you are destroying. Know that you are ending a species that never once stopped reaching for the stars, even when every rational calculation said we should give up. The silence stretched across eternities, waited, her grandmother's pendant warm against her chest, her heart beating steady in her ears. Finally, the architect spoke again. We have reached a decision. Held her breath. And the judgment that followed would change the galaxy forever. The architect's voice resonated across every communications network in council space. Every world, every station, every ship heard the judgment at the same moment. Trillions of beings stopped what they were doing and listened. We have observed 10 million species across 4 billion years. Most follow predictable patterns. They rise, they reach their peak, they decline. They either destroy themselves or stagnate into irrelevance. Your kind follows no pattern we recognize. Ambassador stood perfectly still, waiting for the verdict that would determine humanity's fate. Around her, the impossible geometries of the architect's ship pulsed with ancient light. You wage war against yourselves with terrible ferocity, yet you build monuments to peace. You destroy your own world's ability to support life, then sacrifice to restore it. You create weapons capable of ending your species, then create agreements to ensure those weapons are never used. The architect's attention shifted, and suddenly could feel it examining the council members on the planet below. The ancient beings who had ruled the galaxy for 12 million years trembled under that gaze. You called them primitive, you restricted their growth, you feared their potential. A sound echoed through subspace. It might have been laughter. You were right to fear, but not for the reasons you believed. Every display in council space flickered and changed. They all showed the same images now. Humanity's journey compressed into minutes. The first cave paintings, rough handprints on stone walls. The first cities rising from river valleys. The great plagues that killed millions and the survivors who rebuilt from the ashes. Wars that should have ended everything, and peace treaties written in the blood of the fallen. The images showed humanity at its worst. Genocides, slavery, nuclear weapons pointed at cities full of children, the systematic destruction of their own planet's forests and oceans and atmosphere. But the images also showed humanity at its best. Scientists working through the night to cure diseases. Strangers forming human chains to rescue flood victims. Astronauts risking everything to step onto the surface of their moon, not for wealth or power, but simply to prove it could be done. The architects showed it all, holding nothing back. The violence and the kindness, the hatred and the love, the destruction and the creation. And then they spoke again. The trial is complete. The species designated humanity is not guilty of anomaly. They are the embodiment of what we hoped life might become when we first seeded this galaxy with the building blocks of existence. Felt her knees weaken. She forced herself to remain standing. They are chaotic. They are improbable. They are endlessly striving towards something better, even when they fail more often than they succeed. They are what life should be. The architect turned its attention back to, and she felt the full weight of its ancient regard. Your probationary status is ended. Humanity will have full council membership, full voting rights, full access to the technological archives that the council has hoarded for millions of years. The restrictions that bound you are dissolved. Opened her mouth to speak, but the architect was not finished. But we leave you with a warning, Ambassador. You are no longer the underestimated. The galaxy is watching now. Every species from here to the edge of known space has seen what you are. They have seen your capacity for destruction and your capacity for growth. The ancient being leaned closer. If such a word could apply to a creature that existed partly outside of normal space. What will you do with that attention? What will you become when you no longer have the excuse of being unknown? Thought for a long moment. She thought of her grandmother, who had survived horrors and still taught her granddaughter to be kind. She thought of, who had sacrificed everything to save 30,000 strangers. She thought of every human who had ever looked at an impossible challenge and refused to accept defeat. The same thing we have always done, she said finally. Surprise everyone, including ourselves. The architect made that sound again, the one that might have been laughter. We will be watching, Ambassador. We suspect the next few will be very interesting indeed. The ancient ship as suddenly as it had appeared. One moment it filled the sky. The next moment the stars were visible again, unchanged, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The council descended into chaos. Species that had ruled the galaxy for millions of years now had to share power with beings they had dismissed as primitives. Old alliances crumbled. New ones formed. The comfortable order that had governed a quarter of the galaxy was shattered beyond repair. And humanity stepped into its new role with the same determination it had brought to every other challenge it had ever faced. 50 years later, a statue stood in the center of New Geneva, the city that had become the new capital of human civilization. It depicted Ambassador Sarah, her hand outstretched toward the stars, her face calm and determined. Had died peacefully at the age of 93, surrounded by family, having seen her species take its place among the powers of the galaxy. She had watched human scientists unlock the secrets of the architect technology. She had watched human diplomats negotiate treaties that would have been impossible a generation before. She had watched her people reach for challenges that should have been beyond them, and succeed more often than anyone expected. Visitors from across the galaxy came to see the statue. Council delegates who had once looked down on humanity now came as students, hopping to learn from the species that had proven them all wrong. Survivors came to pay their respects to the people who had taught them the cost of aggression. Even the occasional architect probe drifted through human space, watching, recording, studying. They all stopped to read the inscription at the base of the statue. The words had been chosen by herself, written in her final years as a message to future generations. They told us we were primitive. They told us we were violent. They told us we would never matter. They were half right. We are violent in our love, in our hope, in our absolute refusal to surrender to despair. We fight for the things we believe in with everything we have. We rage against the dying of the light. This is not a flaw. This is our greatest strength. This is humanity's gift to the galaxy. We will never stop reaching. We will never stop dreaming. We will never stop becoming more than we were. and heaven help anyone who tries to stop us. The Galactic Council had made many mistakes in its 12-million-year history. It had misjudged threats and squandered opportunities. It had failed species that needed help and helped species that needed to be stopped. But none of their mistakes had been quite so spectacular or quite so fortunate as underestimating humanity. Because in the end, the primitive species from the unremarkable spiral arm had done exactly what Ambassador had promised all those years ago in the crystal chambers of the council hall. They had made the galaxy remember them. And the galaxy would never forget.